The Sentinel's Vigil by Miles Calder. Private Thomas Aldridge stood motionless, his back pressed against the rough bark of an ancient oak tree. The waning moon hung low in the sky, its feeble light barely penetrating the heavy clouds that threatened rain. The night air was thick with tension, broken only by the occasional hoot of a distant owl. Thomas had been on picket duty for what felt like an eternity, his eyes straining to pierce the gloom of the forest that separated the Union camp from the Confederate lines. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, as heavy as the rifle in his hands. As he stood his lonely vigil, Thomas's thoughts drifted to home, to the small farm in Ohio where his wife Sarah and young son, Tommy Jr., waited for his return. The memory of their faces was both a comfort and a torment. What would become of them if he fell here, in this godforsaken wilderness of Northern Virginia? Sarah's last letter had arrived just yesterday, carried by a mud-spattered courier who'd somehow made it through the Confederate lines. Thomas had read it by firelight, drinking in every word like a man dying of thirst. She wrote of the farm, of how the spring planting was coming along, of little Tommy's first attempts at reading. But between the lines, Thomas could sense her worry, her loneliness. "I pray for your safe return every night," she'd written. "Tommy asks for you constantly. He's growing so fast, Thomas. I fear he'll be a man before you see him again." The words had cut Thomas to the quick. He'd joined up with dreams of glory, of heroic charges and valiant deeds. The reality had been far different. There was no glory in watching a man's life ebb away, no valor in the screams of the wounded as the surgeons worked their grim trade. A twig snapped somewhere to his left. Thomas froze, his breath catching in his throat. He raised his rifle, the weight of it suddenly unfamiliar in his trembling hands. For long moments he waited, every muscle taut with anticipation. Nothing. Slowly he lowered the rifle, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain it would give away his position. It was probably just an animal, he told himself. A raccoon or a possum going about its nightly business, unconcerned with the affairs of men and their wars. As the night wore on, Thomas found his mind wandering, despite his best efforts to stay alert. He thought of the battle they'd fought just 2 days prior, of the men he'd seen fall. The memory of it made his stomach churn. They'd been ordered to take a small hill, a seemingly insignificant piece of high ground that had suddenly become the most important place in the world. Thomas had watched as his friends, men he'd trained with, eaten with, laughed with, charged up that slope. Many never made it to the top. He remembered Private Johnson, barely 18, his face still smooth as a child's, struck down by enemy fire. And Sergeant O'Brien, a bear of a man with a booming laugh, critically wounded by artillery. Thomas had held O'Brien's hand as he passed, listening to the big man's labored breathing grow weaker and weaker until it stopped altogether. The faces of the fallen haunted Thomas, appearing unbidden in the shadows of the forest. He shook his head, trying to dispel the grim visions. He had to stay focused. The lives of his comrades depended on his vigilance. Hours passed, each one stretching into what felt like days. Thomas's legs ached from standing so long, and his eyes burned with fatigue. But he didn't dare sit down or close his eyes, even for a moment. He'd heard stories of sentries who'd fallen asleep at their posts, only to wake to the sounds of their camp being overrun. As the eastern sky began to lighten, painting the clouds with the first faint hints of dawn, Thomas allowed himself a small sigh of relief. He'd made it through another night. Soon his replacement would arrive, and he could return to camp for a few precious hours of sleep. But just as he was about to relax his guard, a rustling in the underbrush snapped Thomas back to full alertness. This time he was certain it wasn't an animal. The sound was too deliberate, too measured. His finger tightened on the trigger as a figure emerged from the shadows. "Halt! Who goes there?" Thomas called out, his voice sounding strange and small in the vast darkness. The figure stopped, raising its hands slowly. "Don't shoot, friend. I'm one of yours." Thomas peered into the gloom, making out the shape of a Union uniform. He relaxed slightly but kept his rifle raised. "Advance and be recognized." The soldier stepped forward, his features becoming clearer in the dim light. He was young, probably no older than Thomas himself, with a thin face and eyes that seemed too large for his head. "Corporal James Hawkins, 12th Ohio," the soldier said. "I've got urgent dispatches from regiment headquarters. There's been a change in enemy movements, and I need to alert all our pickets immediately." Thomas lowered his rifle, a mix of relief and concern washing over him. "What's happened?" Hawkins glanced around nervously. "Not here. It's too exposed. We need to gather the other sentries. Can you lead me to them?" Thomas hesitated. He wasn't supposed to leave his post, but Corporal Hawkins outranked him, and if there truly was urgent news about enemy movements, It could mean the difference between life and death for his fellow soldiers. The memory of the recent battle, of friends lost due to incomplete intelligence, weighed heavily on his mind. "All right," Thomas said after a moment's consideration, "but we need to be quick. My relief will be here soon, and I don't want to leave this section unguarded for long." Hawkins nodded gratefully. "Understood. Lead the way, Private." They set off together, moving as quietly as they could through the underbrush. Thomas led the way, his eyes now accustomed to the darkness. He moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned the hard way that a misstep in these woods could mean a twisted ankle or worse. As they walked, Thomas kept his ears open for any sound that might indicate Confederate pickets. The enemy lines weren't far, and patrols from both sides often crossed paths in the no-man's land between camps. They had gone perhaps a quarter mile when Hawkins spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Say, Private, how long have you been out here on picket duty?" "Since midnight," Thomas replied, keeping his voice equally low. "It's been a long night." Hawkins nodded sympathetically. "I can imagine. It's not an easy job, but it's crucial. You never know when the enemy might try to slip through our lines." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine at those words. Something in Hawkins's tone had changed, a hint of an accent that hadn't been there before. He turned to look at the other man, his suspicion growing. "Corporal," Thomas said carefully, "you mentioned you were from the 12th Ohio. What town are you from?" Hawkins hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "Cincinnati," he said, but the word sounded forced. Thomas's hand tightened on his rifle. "That's interesting," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, because the 12th Ohio was raised in Cleveland. For a moment, the forest was deathly silent. Then, with a speed that took Thomas by surprise, Hawkins reached into his coat and pulled out a revolver. Thomas raised his rifle, but he knew he was too late. At this range, Hawkins couldn't miss. "You're Confederate," he said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Hawkins nodded. "A scout. I was sent to gather intelligence on your positions. I didn't want to hurt anyone if I could avoid it." "Then don't," Thomas pleaded. "You can still walk away from this." For a moment, Hawkins seemed to consider it. But then his face hardened. "I can't do that. The information I've gathered could save hundreds of Confederate lives. I'm sorry, I truly am." Thomas saw Hawkins's finger tighten on the trigger. In that instant, his life flashed before his eyes. He saw Sarah's face, heard Tommy's laughter. He thought of the farm, of the life he'd left behind, of the future he'd never see. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the forest, startlingly loud in the pre-dawn stillness. Thomas felt a searing pain in his chest, and then he was falling, the world tilting crazily around him. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Above him, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves tinged with the first light of dawn. It was beautiful, Thomas thought distantly. As his vision began to darken, Thomas thought of Sarah and Tommy. He saw their faces, bright with love and hope. He heard Tommy's laughter, felt Sarah's arms around him. In that moment, despite the pain and the encroaching darkness, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. Though he would never see them again in this life, he knew that Sarah and Tommy would be proud of him. As dawn broke over the Virginia wilderness, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, the forest fell silent once more. The great conflict would rage on, but for one brave soldier, the long night's vigil had finally come to an end.